Welcome to Educational Updates. I'm Jonas Nordquist.
And I'm Teresa Sörö.
This Educational Updates is a short series of programs to keep you as a faculty member at Karolinska Institutet updated on various topics relating to medical and health professions education. Our guest today is Professor Geoff Norman from McMaster University in Canada. Professor Norman is well known for his research in cognition learning, extensive research on problem-based learning, and also on assessment. The topic this morning would be assessment. It's always said assessment is driving learning. So, Professor Norman, warmly welcome to the program.
Thanks very much.
If you were to look back to the, let's say, 60s, how do you see the evolution in assessing in health professions education?
Well, I haven't been in the field quite since the 60s. I'm not quite that old. However, when I began, which was in the early 70s, the prevailing culture was that we were after skills, and so I was actually recruited to investigate clinical problem-solving skills. And we had problem-solving skills, and we had data-gathering skills, and we had communication skills, and we had critical thinking skills, and we had all these sort of skills. And that was the way the field was at. And so when we talked assessment, we were talking about assessing skills. It didn't take long before the fundamental research that I was involved in showed that that was really not an adequate model. That if you looked at it, you found that whatever you measured on a single patient encounter had a very, very low correlation with what happened on the next patient encounter. John Norsini, a colleague of ours, has said that the single most important discovery in medical education is content specificity, which basically says that all of these process measures of the process of thinking or reasoning actually are anchored to the content of the problem. That finding is universal. It applies to even things like communication skills, which intuitively we think are general. That is, there are good communicators and bad communicators. In fact, that's not the way it is. Communication, you have to communicate about something, and so it too is anchored to content. That has major implications for the way we go about assessment. The subsequent 30 or 40 years has seen many, many changes in assessment, many, many different kinds of assessment approaches. But if you look carefully at the science behind them, the psychometrics, a very clear pattern emerges. The assessment methods that work because they're taking multiple samples and averaging over all those contents and contexts. So multiple choice questions are unassailably the single most universal method. They assess knowledge, admittedly only knowledge, but because there's so many observations taken, it's basically biopsying the organ many, many times. And as a consequence, it ends up having better predictive validity than other measures that look like they're closer to real life. Similarly, the OSCE, the Objective Structured Clinical Examination, works simply because it's taking multiple observations, typically 15 or 20 10-minute biopsies of performance. And conversely, the methods that don't work, like essays, the standard long case oral exam, don't work because they're not sampling broadly. So that means that the very complex field that I entered became a very simple field. We didn't have to worry nearly as much about various formats as we were. It basically came down to a very simple premise, that if you make multiple observations, you're going to get good measurement, and if you don't, you aren't. And that makes the world a lot simpler. I guess a corollary to that is that although there's a preoccupation with different kinds of measures, and you can still see many writings that suggest that you really have to use multiple formats, I don't see the world that way. It seems to me that if we have a good measure of knowledge, and I would anchor back to multiple choice, although short answer is perfectly acceptable as an alternative, if we have a good measure of knowledge and a good measure of performance, first of all, we're going to get good measurement overall in terms of the complexity of things that amount to competence. Secondly, the combination of those two measures is going to steer students to do precisely what we want them to do. On the one hand, acquire the knowledge they need to become a professional, and on the other hand, acquire the kind of skills that make them survive in a clinical setting. So the world of assessment has become a fairly simple place in my view. It's not nearly as complex or difficult as it appeared to be at one point. It really comes down to a very simple admonition, which is when all else fails, increase the sample size. The more observations you make, the better the measurement. One more corollary of that, though, is that means that things like worrying about assessor training, or worrying about specific item formats, or worrying about whether it should be a 5-point or 7-point scale, all of those are non-issues. None of these format effects that we used to worry and anguish about seem to have much impact. Essentially, certainly, it's well proven that, for example, multiple choice and short answer questions are virtually interchangeable. Short orals are virtually interchangeable with written tests. Recent work suggests that if we're trying to get students to acquire clinical reasoning, we can get just as much information, students can derive just as much information from a written case as they can from a video case, as they come from a standardized patient. So there are universals that we weren't aware of 20 or 30 years ago, but that certainly seem to be emerging these days.
So, Professor Norman, you say that the world is a lot more simpler nowadays than it used to. Yeah, great. So are there any urban myths regarding assessment, you would say?
There are lots of urban myths. I mean, one is, for example, that multiple choice measures recognition and short answer measures recall, and recognition and recall are different. In fact, they're the same. The correlations have been demonstrated to range upwards from 0.95. But my favorite urban myth is one that we all fall prey to. We've all been in the situation of been working through the final exam. And the final exam I'll frame as being a multiple choice exam. And so you finish early, you've got 20 minutes on the exam. You decide to go back and review the questions. And you get to question 13. And you look carefully at it, and you answered C, but it could be A. So the question arises, should you change or should you stick? Now, I've asked this question to undergraduates, to graduates, to faculty. I've asked the question to hundreds and hundreds of people. 98% of them say you should go with your gut. You should stick to it.
Absolutely.
You should stay.
Absolutely, I would.
Yes, and you'll be wrong. It turns out, when you think about it, it's such an obvious question to investigate. And the way they have investigated it in about 15 studies dating back about 60 years. Remember the old mark sense forms where you put a little pencil mark in the box? All you do is you go through the form and look at the places where it was erased, and you look at the places where it stayed. And you'll find that the ones that are still dark are likely to be a little bit more correct than the ones that were erased. So the uniform, absolutely uniform, consistent, universal finding is that you're slightly more likely to be correct slightly with the new answer than with the old. And yet everybody falls prey to the myth of stick with the gut.
Interesting. So do you have any last tips for medical educators regarding assessment?
I think it follows directly from what I was saying before. In fact, we were worried more than we have to be about things like setting up standardized structured scenarios. I guess the best example of that is, again, the OSCE, the Objective Structured Clinical Examination. Its claim was that it was objective, and therefore that was going to give better measurement. And so there would be endless efforts put into devising the checklists and getting agreement on which items should or should not be on the checklists, training the raters, training the standardized patients, and then you had to have this incredible administrative superstructure to make sure that the bells went off at the right time and the students rushed from door to door and the signs on the doors were right and all this stuff. What's been emerging fairly clearly is, although we agree that performance assessment is a good thing, a lot of those efforts are unnecessary, and you can see all sorts of movements recently towards workplace-based assessment, which basically takes the premise that every supervisor, and these are the people we're talking to now, every supervisor in a clinical setting has all sorts of opportunities to do assessment. They have many encounters with the resident or the student in the course of a day. The encounters could be about any number of things. The trouble is those encounters aren't documented, and typically what happens is you wait until the end of the 3-month rotation to fill out some piece of paper. The current strategy are methods called mini CEX and clinical work sampling, which says just capture those moments. And typically we'll give you a card that has a single 7-point scale on it and a little bit of space saying, here's what we talked about, here's some things that the student could work on, and here's my overall rating on a 7-point scale. That kind of assessment, which is virtually cost-free, gives every bit as good measurement as the more complex structured OSCE by the time you get to 8 or 12 or 15 or 20 observations. Again, the standard axiom is when all else fails, increase the sample size. And that's the kind of very simple strategy that any supervisor in any clinical setting can avail themselves of. It really comes down to simply documenting what's happening already rather than trying to set up elaborate, complex, structured evaluation situations.
Thank you. Before we close for today, I open with a question about, does assessment drive learning? And your straight answer is?
Sure.
Sure.
And that's a good thing. What that means, though, is that assessors, instructors, clinicians have the responsibility to devise assessment systems which will drive learning in the directions they want it to go. Rather than viewing it as an evil to be overcome, we should view it as one of the biggest tools we have in our toolkit for education.
Well, thank you, Professor Norman, for joining us here this morning. And this will be all for today from Education Updates. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.